What these missing hikers went through will make you feel ill. Before we begin, this video contains accounts of kidnapping, attempted abduction, death, and psychological trauma. If anything here is likely to be triggering for you, please take care. If you are watching now and are personally affected by similar experiences, reach out for help. Hotlines, local emergency services, a trusted person. If you're ready, stay with me. If you like deep dives into true horror and survival stories, hit subscribe. This channel relies on you so we can keep telling these voices. I've spent months piecing together first-person accounts from people who walked into ordinary days and came inches from disappearing. Some of them were literally on trails or at campsites. Others were in neighborhoods, abandoned schools, or parking lots, places you would never expect to become a slow, patient trap. I'm going to read these to you as they were told to me. Small, sharp reports of sound and motion, moments that rearranged the rest of someone's life. Not every story here is about a hiker who vanished, but every single one echoes the same rules of danger that stalk the edges of trails, campgrounds, and lonely coastal roads. Listen to one voice at a time. These are the kinds of nights that begin with nothing more than a winded sigh over the dunes and end with your choices or someone else's, deciding whether the morning will ever come. The parking lot at the edge of the beach was almost empty. They'd chosen it because it seemed safe. A wide shoulder, a curb, a view of the lighthouse. 2 people, late summer air. The small, stubborn idea that you could sleep in a car at the seam where forest meets sand. He wrapped a coat around his shoulders like a blanket. She kept a bottle of water between her knees. They thought of the gulls and of coffee the next morning. They thought, too, that a quiet place would give them invisible. Content warning for violence and missing persons before the next piece. Then the noise started. 2 different kinds. Far off, a car idling, the occasional scrape of someone moving across gravel. Close up, the dull, metallic thud that made them sit up together, the kind of sound you don't expect on a beach, a shovel hitting sand, over and over. He whispered, "Did you hear that?" She said, "I'm not sure," but she was. She saw the beam of headlights sweep the dunes and then vanish. They didn't go outside. They pulled the car door almost shut, turned the tiny interior light down, and tried to make themselves into shadows. The hours stretched into a thin wire. At some point there was a scream, not long, a single ragged sound that threaded across the parking lot and died on the wind. It was close enough to be an instrument string plucked inside the chest. They pressed flat to the seats. Neither of them slept. When the sky started to wash with pale, someone drove slow past the lot, slow enough to look in.
The couple stayed pretending to be asleep until the car passed. Later, when they turned on the radio in the morning and heard a police bulletin about missing men and murders near that very stretch of coast, the things they'd heard at night snapped into a vast, dreadful possibility. They left the keys, the blankets, everything behind, and drove until the memory of the dunes was a blur. "I heard a shovel," she told me. "I heard something digging, and then there was a scream." The way she said it was small, only the edges of the memory still sharp, and also huge, like the world had folded in one tiny, catastrophic night. There's no neat ending to that kind of night. They got away. They were not the ones who were reported missing. But the proximity, the knowledge that someone had been there, that someone was moving heavy tools at midnight just beyond the dune line, changes how you think about any lot you park your car in after dark. It turns the ordinary choice of where to sleep into a question with stakes. These stories don't all involve backpacks in the wilderness. Sometimes the danger waits at the edges of the places hikers cross on their way in. The trailhead parking lot, the darkened rest area, the stretch of road where you pull over to check a map. Predators study patterns. They learn where people stop. They use the same tricks over and over. Content warning for stalking, grooming, and kidnapping before the next story. Alyssa and Leah are names you'll hear from different mouths in different places. For some people it's one name. For others the same story is told with another. In the way these accounts were passed to me, they function like a composite, a woman who felt favored by attention that suddenly hardened into something else, a friendship that turned into surveillance. He contacted her as if by accident, an offer of work, a strange friendship that started with a message about local trails and ended with a request to meet. The communications were comforting at first. Verification of routes, suggestions for safe spots, invitations to coffee near trailheads so they could talk about maps. These are the lures predators use. Helpfulness, a living map that makes you think you're being protected.
She told me she looked him up and found photos, old arrest pictures crumpled on an obscure forum, faces flagged in gray. When she confronted him, he smiled in the way people smile to make you believe them. Later, she found evidence that she'd been photographed at the edge of a trail, the way somebody had stood in the trees and taken a picture of a car, the timestamp a subtle slice into her day. She filed a report. The police found more than she expected. Arrests were made, and the more public record there is, the safer someone should feel. But the fixity of what happened, the way it had been written down on those photos, on the timelines, left her raw. "I nearly became bait," she said. I didn't know until I found the photos."
The most haunting thing about her voice was the quiet of it. There was no hysterical flourish, only a brittle calm that had learned to map every shadow. What she experienced is what many hikers and solo campers mean when they say, "I felt watched." It's not necessarily the sense of an odd bird or a fox. It's the knowledge that a human being has placed themselves to intercept you, at the trailhead, at the edge of a parking lot, offering help that is not help. Grooming is slow and patient. It is a predator imitating kindness until you step into a place where you are isolated. Again, she survived. Charges were filed. She moved. Because survival wasn't only about the moment that saved her life, it was about reclaiming daily ground. But the memory persists like a wound that never quite scabs. If you think that's only an online slippery slope, think of parking lots as psych maps. Menacing gestures and offers of help are the same patterns, whether someone meets you at a coffee shop or at the place where the trail begins. A hiker who says they feel watched is often not being dramatic. They are naming a predatory strategy. I want to shift now to a story that is not about trails, but that teaches the same lesson about vulnerability after dark and about the thin margin between ordinary care and extraordinary danger. This next one is about a teenager babysitting on the edge of a small town. Content warning: attempted abduction and child endangerment. Bella was 17 and babysitting a 4-year-old in a house that sat 2 blocks from an overgrown bike path that led to the woods. The child fell asleep. The streetlight cast a thin circle on the sidewalk. That quiet hour is the one that chews at a lot of people's nerves. Bella made hot cocoa and checked the stove. Then the knocks started. Slow, polite, a pattern that sounded like someone testing the door. She looked out and saw a silhouette moving along the side yard, a figure too close to the windows, halting, peering. The little girl stirred. The man knocked again and then banged, harder, at the door. Bella called the house number. No answer from inside, and then she picked up the phone and dialed 911. When officers came, the man was still outside, pressed up against a shadowed hedge, somewhere between escape and standoff. He had been reported as an escaped patient in a nearby facility, someone whose name appeared in a police bulletin that had gone out earlier that week. Officers moved fast. The child was safe. The man was taken into custody. The last thing Bella told me was how her hands had not unclenched for days. "I kept thinking about every window I'd left unlocked that week," she said. "I kept thinking about being alone with just the sound of someone outside." Her voice learned to measure its hours by new fences she'd built in her mind. These moments, an escaped patient, a man who shouldn't have been free, are not all that different from meeting someone at a trailhead who says they know the way. Both situations hinge on the presence of another human calculating what you will do when you are by yourself. The methods change, but the danger's grammar stays the same. They test a vulnerability, and they keep testing until something gives. Now consider places where curiosity pulls people into abandoned structures: the schools with boarded windows and creaking stairwells, the mansions with overgrown driveways. I spoke with a pair of urban explorers, Ben and a friend, who went into Roosevelt Elementary because the rumors about it were everywhere: collapsed ceilings, old lockers, graffiti layers like scabs. They didn't go there to trespass and cause harm. They went because the pull was the same as any explorer's pull: the fascination with a place that remembers. Ben and his friend parked at the cleared lot 2 streets from the playground, backpacks with flashlights and a camera. On the way in, there were stray dogs and the smell of paint solvent. Sunlight fell through broken glass. The building had a stillness that tasted like a place that time had passed by. In the main corridor, a door that should have been locked was propped open by chance or by someone else's hand. They laughed at a busted sink and at the way their own breath echoed. Then something shifted.
a shape in the doorway of the gym, a man whose grin was too slow, the kind of grin that reads like a practiced mask. Ben told me the man stood there and watched them for a long beat. He had this grin like he expected us to run, Ben said, like he was waiting to see if we would be the joke. They ran. The man didn't shout, didn't chase in a way that lets you identify him. He only moved at the margin of sight, enough to make them keep running until asphalt replaced linoleum under their shoes. Later, footage from their camera, grainy light, a flash of a grin, was shared online. Town meetings followed. Roosevelt Elementary closed down for good not long after. Explore and you'll sometimes find a place that seems empty and used to being watched. But places with no official occupation attract people who prefer to be off the map. The explorers escaped physically, and the town escaped a worse headline. But the tension remains. Abandoned spaces are like hollows in a body, where something can hide and wait. I could have stopped there and let the fear sit, but the pattern runs deeper. In the hinterlands between an ordinary lane and the woods, predators and accidents both find the same vulnerability: solitude. Roads that let you get to a trailhead also let a vehicle stop in the dark where there's no one to hear a suffocating sound or notice a headlight that never flicks off. There's a story I'll hold for the next segment, one about a guard who found people hidden in a mansion's basement and the lingering image of a white gown. But before I move on, I want to pull a thread tight.
Think about the small decisions that look like nothing: where to park, whether to accept a ride, whether to stay for another minute to answer a message. For hikers, these decisions are the margin between routine and disaster. For babysitters and campers and urban explorers, they are the exact same margin. When you walk a trail, you are performing an unspoken ritual of trust. You trust the map, you trust your fitness, you trust your plan. Predators and accidents exploit that trust by disrupting the variables that make your day ordinary, removing light, introducing a human whose presence feels casual, making the road an instrument of panic. Those are the tactics: slow, patient, opportunistic. They are the things the people I spoke with learned to name after the fact. The next accounts get darker. Some of them end with rescue, some with arrests, some with scars that never fully heal. I'm going to tell you one or two more now because the shape of this playlist of events is about escalation, how a handful of small, nervous noises can lead into sequences you may not imagine in the moment. There's a family who camped along a lonely stretch of coast in Sweden. This was the story I mentioned before, and the fact that it happened on a foreign shore added a strange disorientation to it. Different signage, a different dialect, the same human dangers rendered in another language. They chose a pull-off beside an old lifeguard shack, intending to crawl into a narrow, safe sleep. The beach was wide and empty. Someone drove slowly by, headlights sweeping the low dunes. That shovel noise came again. The woman whispered, "Someone's digging." The scream followed. In the morning, there were police cars and a news clip about men who had been last seen walking the cliffs. The family left the keys and fled. Another voice I recorded told me of a man who had been following her for weeks. He learned her routes and the way she liked to stop at a certain overlook to eat. He was careful with his timing, always distant at first, then less so. She outed him online before she left town, which helped the police. He was arrested, she relocated. But the theft of safety doesn't end with arrests. The memory of being targeted becomes a lens through which you watch the world. I want to be clear about one thing the people who survived say over and over. Escape often depends on small, improvisational decisions. A scream, a locked door, the decision to get back into a car and drive until the lights blur. A man who left, a phone call to 911, a neighbor who happened to be awake. That small tangle of luck and action is almost always part of the story. And that is why, when hikers tell me what happened, the first thing out of their mouths is not a map or the name of the trail. It is what they did in the seconds that felt like an eternity. Pause with me here and picture this. You are alone at the trailhead at dusk. Everything looks normal.
You tuck your pack into the trunk, and somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, you hear something that does not belong. The scrape of a shovel, a footstep, a voice that sounds like someone calling your name from across a hollow. The stories I've read all start with that little wrong noise. I've told you about the parking lot at the beach, about a woman who found herself baited, about a babysitter who stood watch while a stranger banged at a door, and I followed a pair of explorers who ran from a smiling man in an abandoned school. These are fragments of a larger pattern. There are more fragments, some that circle closer to what you think of as hiking, campers on solitary coasts, people walking late on park trails, families that choose the wrong pull-off, and some that are only similar because the mechanism of threat is the same. One account I've saved for later because it combines the worst of both worlds, a place of supposed safety like a house or a mansion that hides a space where people were kept, hidden from view. The person who spoke about that night still hears the sound of a scream as if it were threaded on a loop. They told me plainly, "I heard someone. I went to look. I found them." The image of an underground room with a person tied or trapped is the exact reason we say, do not walk alone in the dark. Tell someone where you're going. Do not accept rides from strangers. Simple precepts that sound obvious until they're not. And that brings us to why we're here with this title. What these missing hikers went through will make you feel ill. The title is blunt because the feeling is blunt, an animal reflex of dread. But I need to reiterate the framing. Not every story I'm telling concerns a literal missing hiker. Some are about people who almost vanished, some about those who vanished emotionally, who were crushed by hallucination, guilt, or sudden grief. A few of the testimonies actually report missing people found later. Others are open questions, unresolved files. The common denominator is a movement from ordinary day into extinction, or near extinction, by way of isolation, cunning, or pure accident. Before I continue, a quick note on safety tied directly to hikers. Tell someone your route and your estimated return. Carry a charged phone and a power bank. Favor trailheads with more foot traffic. Lock your car. Don't accept rides from people you don't know. And if someone approaches you and you feel unsafe, keep moving towards populated areas and call for help. When we resume, I'll tell you about that mansion guard who found victims hidden below a house that looked like it belonged to someone who had been maintaining a long secret. I'll tell you the full account of Brent's accident and the shame and reconciliation that followed. I'll sit with a student who'd been convinced by an image in the classroom until it bled into her life and turned into hallucination.
Some of these accounts end with arrests and rescue. Others end with people still missing, or with a silence that families carry. For now, keep the image of the dune, the shovel, the scream, and the small acts that decide whether someone wakes up in the morning or does not. The snap of a tire, the beam of a flashlight, the awkward, practiced grin on an intruder's face, these are the constants. There's no heroic symmetry to most of these stories. Where movies give closure, real life gives fragments to pick at. A police report, a smear of light on a surveillance tape, a witness who remembers a car's bumper. What survivors keep are sensations, metallic clicks, the smell of gasoline, the thinness of the air when running through a school hallway, the inexplicable certainty that another human had rehearsed this encounter. They keep one other thing too, a sense of being permanently altered. "I don't walk the same way anymore," one woman told me. "I don't cross the street the same." So far, you've heard about nights where people left with the routine expectation of ordinary morning and instead found themselves holding in their mouths sounds that would never let them sleep normally again. You've heard of predators who groomed and watched, and of escaped patients who learned a dangerous route. You've seen how abandoned buildings can hide someone who prefers the liminal spaces where people forget to go. You've heard of the crumbly line that divides a routine trip from a disappearance. When I come back, I'll move deeper into a cluster of stories that is harder to speak about. The basement rescued by a guard, and the man who accidentally caused a death in a moment of panic, and now carries the kind of guilt that reshapes him. I'll also tell the story of a student whose world dissolved into terrifying visions, what one caller described as a slow vanishing from the inside, and of a group of teens who ran from something hooded in a cemetery and took with them a narrative that still circulates on late-night forums. Stay with the images I've left, the shovel at the dune, the grin in a doorway, the knock on a babysitter's door. These are the scenes that pivot a life. And if you're watching because you want to make sure you never become part of a horror story like this, remember the smallest protections. Share your plans, choose places with people, keep your lights on, and listen to that unease when it comes. It is a life-saving thing to be suspicious in the right moment. The night the guard walked the long stone hall of a converted mansion, he thought it was an ordinary shift. He thought he'd check doors, record any oddities, and sign off. What he found instead was a scream, and then a narrow corridor that led down somewhere no one expected.
I'll tell you about what he did, and about the people he found, because those people matter. They deserve to be remembered for the horror they survived, and for the fact that their rescue was not inevitable, but the result of someone who paid attention, who chose to enter rather than stand aside. He told me he'd been on his second lap of the East Wing when the sound came, sharp, an animal sound threaded through with something human, a ragged cord that made the guard's teeth clench. He'd been there for years and learned the building's small languages, the way a radiator coughed in winter, the soft creak of a stair that always complained the same way. This sound was different. It came from below. Content warning. The next segment contains descriptions of kidnapping, abuse, and rescue. If this will be distressing, please consider skipping ahead. If you're affected by what you hear, pause and seek support from a trusted person or local services. He moved toward it because his job was to move toward it. That was the first thing he said. You don't walk away when someone's voice cuts through a place like that. The mansion had been converted, wings added, basements extended, so there were places on his rounds he didn't often think about. The scream came again, quieted like a held breath, but it was close enough he could hear syllables, a name that didn't belong in that house. There was a heavy door at the end of a corridor, the kind of iron thing the old owners once used to store wine. It wasn't supposed to be unlocked. It was. He shoved it. Cold air blew up the stairwell and smelled like damp and other people's breath. He took his flashlight and stepped down. The light found faces. They were tied, he said, but that is a word he used carefully. Hands bound, yes, but also faces wet with tears, mouths small from shouting until they had no sound left. There was one person who looked at him the way the only person who's been kept in a small dark room looks. Immediate, luminous relief braided with disbelief. A woman whispered, "You came," and the guard felt something in his chest like a cliff giving way. Later he would tell investigators he didn't remember calling the station because his stomach had hardened into movement. Unlock, free, get out. The police came, of course. Officers filled the great hallway with radio static and boots and the thin paper rustle of tags. There were questions, long forms, the procedural coldness that arrives after something terrible has been undone. The guard stayed because he could not understand leaving. He said, "I kept thinking, what else has been hidden under our floors? What else stays because no one ever listened for it?" What remained unanswered and has kept people talking in Maplewood was that the guard also reported seeing something he could not place. In the glare of his flashlight, before the police herded everyone out, he swore he saw a white gown slipping through a doorway that led to an older wing.
Not a person in clothing, but a shape like cloth with a mind of its own, he tried to explain. An impression more than a figure. Some said fatigue. Some said the mind makes patterns when it's desperate to complete a story. Others whispered about the old owners and how certain rooms were always colder, like places that had never been properly aired. Whatever the explanation, the important, non-ambiguous fact is this. People who were being held were freed because someone made the choice to go down the stairs rather than walk past. The rescue was real. The captives were relocated, interviews were done, and for some, the process of rebuilding began. For others, the rescue began a different kind of life, one made of appointments, uncertain nights, and the effort to remember sunlight without each beam acting as a trigger. There wasn't a neat cinematic arc where everything got clean in a week. Some of them never said my name again, the guard told me with a low, careful voice. They learned to look at me and not see me. I carried that. It shaped him afterward. The guard patrolled less like a man with a schedule and more like someone who had opened a door he never wanted to open again. That choice still matters. The margin between being hidden and being found is almost always a single person's decision to act. That decision thread of a single action unspooling a nightmare is a recurring pattern in these accounts. So are the small things that people swear change them forever. A creak on an attic floor, a shadow over a window, the sudden wrongness of a familiar house. Which brings me to a story closer to home, telling in the first-person voice I heard from a woman who grew up in a house that kept its own memory. This one isn't about someone taken by strangers on a trail, but it is about being watched, and about a place that felt set to swallow people like breath into cold air. Content warning. The next account references sustained psychological trauma and feelings of being watched. She and her sister Jessica were children when the house started acting like a living thing. It began with small noises, footsteps over the attic, doors that had been latched swinging open in the morning, the attic trunk that opened even though the lock had not been forced. At night there was the sense of a presence above the ceiling, a slow, patient pacing that matched the rhythm of a person who had nowhere to be, but who decided to be there anyway. They would climb up the pull-down ladder 2 at a time and lie with their backs to the slatted boards, whispering about monsters, until one night they heard someone walking on the shingles like a deliberate, booted human. Jessica looked at the narrator and said, "Someone's on the roof." Their father pointed out the window and said what fathers always say, "Probably animals, probably the wind." But he didn't go out. The children did not sleep. They learned to leave the light on in the hallway, to barricade bedroom doors with chairs.
When their father later sold the house, they walked away carrying the sense of being not alone anywhere for years after. The narrator told me, "I felt that house waiting for me. It changed how I slept. When there's a sound outside now, I plan my exit in my head." For hikers, that pause, the mental plan, is a survival instinct. A person who has been watched by the windows of their own house learns quickly that rehearsal saves you. Where to go, who to call, how fast you can move. The same rehearsal matters on a trail. Note the exits, the open roads, the places that have light or people. The attic story is smaller and quieter than the mansion basement, but it demonstrates a key truth. Danger isn't always dramatic. Often it is slow and domestic. It erodes confidence the way water erodes stone. Hikers and campers report similar corrosion of trust. A trail that used to be a place of solace becomes a locus of calculations. It's time to tell the story that pivoted the mood for many of the people I spoke with, the one that landed like a punch and left the narrator's voice thin for weeks afterward. This is Brent's story. Content warning: this next section contains depictions of an accidental death and lasting emotional consequences for those involved. Brent Thompson was not someone who wanted trouble. He worked nights, answered to his daughter's voice on the phone, and liked quiet roads for thinking. The narrator in this account was driving that night, a routine patrol after a call that turned into a chase he had not intended to escalate. The town it happened in, Lamar County, had a pattern of drivers who ignored stop signs into dark. He'd been responding to what began as a simple pursuit, and then a mistake compounded by panic. He described it like this: a vehicle sped past, he followed. The other driver made a sharp turn, lost control, and stumbled. Someone fell into the line of travel. The narrator swore he did not see the person until it was too late. He slammed on brakes, but his car slid on gravel and metal sang across metal. When he stopped, there was a body, and there was the worst, most irreversible quiet. What followed was the kind of legal and emotional tangle that made ordinary days into an ache. There were investigations, questions about speed and visibility and reaction time, and an answer that did not soothe the narrator. He said, "I kept replaying it 1,000 different ways. I wondered if I could have done anything to stop it. The guilt ate through me." He sought therapy, went to support groups, and eventually made contact with Brent's family. That part of the story is crucial. He did not hide. He tried to make amends. He said he wanted to help, to do whatever he could to rebuild the thing that had been broken. Forgiveness was not simple, he told me. It's not like a switch, but talking mattered, showing up mattered.
Brent's family agreed to meet, and they sat with a man who had been the instrument of their loss and asked hard questions. In the months that followed, the narrator volunteered with a roadside safety program and spoke to teenagers about the cost of panic and the need to slow down. He was not absolved. He was changed. This story isn't about predators in the woods. It's about how accidents on isolated roads, trail access roads, coastal pull-offs, the narrow lanes hikers use to get to trailheads, can end lives as surely as a planned abduction. The lesson hikers take from it is practical. Be visible. Use reflective gear. Tell someone where you're going. And if you see something that could be dangerous, call it in rather than pursue at speed. Panic compounds danger, the way wind scatters a campfire from safe embers into a spreading blaze. From accidental deaths, the thread moves inward, into the mind. Not every disappearance is physical. Some people described a slow erasure of themselves, a dissolving at the edges, where hallucination, grief, and untreated trauma created a private wilderness that swallowed daily life. Miss Andre's story is a vivid example. Content warning: the following includes descriptions of hallucinations and severe psychological distress. Miss Andre was a teacher, and the student who told me about her remembered the first time it happened in class, just a small slide of perception, a shadow that didn't belong behind the projector screen, the sense that a figure had stepped into the room and melted into the wallpaper. At first, it was a technical name, vertigo, stress, but then the images became clearer, faces in the hallway that no one else saw, the whispering of names when the classroom was empty. The student's testimony traces a slow descent, not into melodrama, but into a series of medical appointments, medication trials, and long nights where sleep would not come because the mind folded the day into something else. She told me, "It felt like falling and falling, but never reaching the ground. Things would look right one minute and then wrong the next.
School became a place you wanted to escape without knowing why. Miss Andre, by all accounts, loved her students and tried to get help. A specialist eventually identified a pattern that could be treated, and with therapy and a medication plan, the flashes faded. The student recovered a sense of normalcy, but not entirely. There remained a residue, a wariness about empty halls at dusk, a habit of keeping one hand on the doorknob before passing through. This kind of internal vanishing matters because it looks like a missing person when the loss is not of a body, but of a life. The quiet withdrawal from friends, the collapsed attendance, the person who stops returning calls.
For hikers, the parallel is worth noticing. A hiker who doesn't return might have been caught in a storm, assaulted, or driven to panic, but sometimes they are lost in their own head, disoriented and unable to find the path back to who they were. The way communities respond, search parties, calls, checking last known locations, matters no less because the vanishing mechanism is psychological. It's still a disappearance that requires loving, patient effort to reverse. From the classroom to the cemetery, teenagers with flashlights and a dare. Oakwood Cemetery is an old place on the edge of town where the stones lean like tired people. A group of friends went there one night because that's what teenagers do. They seek edges to test themselves against. The cemetery is the archetype of liminal space, neither quite public park nor private home. It has all the elements these stories exploit: isolation, shadow, the certainty that the natural cadence of day has been interrupted. They walked between columns, their breath white in the film of air, and then someone saw eyes. Glowing, one of them said, which is the way teenagers describe anything frightening with a flair that makes it more mythic. They remembered a hooded figure, a shape that did not look human at the angle their flashlight provided, and they ran. That is the whole story. A sprint across grass, a shiver of fear that becomes legend. No one was harmed, no one was abducted. But the memory of those eyes follows them. It becomes the kind of story that circulates in online threads, changing with each retelling into something bigger. Why tell it? Because hikers often speak of the same adrenaline that runs a group late by a fire. We saw shape, they say. We thought it moved. The body reacts the same way on a deserted ridge at 3 a.m. as it does in a moonlit cemetery. It assumes agency. It invents intent. It decides threat. The trick is to keep your head long enough to validate the fear with observation, and to avoid letting the mind imagine a friction that is worse than the actual facts. That is not to diminish fear, but to channel it into action. Move to light, find others, call for help, rather than narrative escalation. We're reaching the end of the cluster of first-hand accounts now, and the pattern becomes clear if you step back. Most of these events hinge on small things: choices, noises, a single person's attention. The stories vary in scale and kind: an abandoned mansion turned prison, an attic that refuses to let a family sleep, an accidental death on a dark road, a mind that unravels from within, a group of teenagers who run from an imagined figure. But their grammar is the same. Isolation magnifies intent, the ordinary is wounded by the unexpected, and rescue is rarely the product of heroics, and more often the result of someone noticing and acting. Before I close, there are a few specific takeaways I need to give you. These are not platitudes.
They come from the people I spoke to, the ones who learned the hard lessons and tried to pass them on. If you hike, camp, explore, or even babysit in a small town, these are practical steps that may keep you out of a story like the ones you've just heard. First, tell someone where you're going and when you expect to return. It sounds obvious because it is. The simplest possible action, text a friend your route and a time, gives others a starting point if something goes wrong. Second, keep your phone charged and carry a backup battery. A dead phone in a rural place is like being invisible to rescue. Learn how to conserve battery. Airplane mode, dim screen, minimal use. Third, avoid isolated pull-offs after dark when you can. If you must sleep in a car, pick well-lit, populated areas, rest stops with recorded traffic, or designated campgrounds. The parking lot at the edge of the beach in that Sweden story seemed quiet and safe to the couple, until it wasn't. You cannot predict everything, but you can reduce risk. Fourth, trust your instincts about people. When someone offers help in a way that makes you uncomfortable, sudden offers at a trailhead, unprompted guidance, persistent attention, document it. Take photos of license plates or faces if you can do so safely, and report it. Predators study patterns. Making yourself a hard target changes that calculus. Fifth, know the signs of people in distress, and don't be afraid to call for help. The guard who found captives did not wait. The babysitter called 911 and saved a child. In many of these stories, the choice to seek help fixed the outcome. Sixth, for internal vanishing, if you or someone you know starts disappearing into themselves,
Reaching out to mental health professionals is not a weakness. The student who saw things in class recovered because someone identified the pattern and offered sustained help. That kind of attention matters. 7th, after an event, survivors need support, not questions that sound like blame. If someone confides in you, listen, believe them, and help them find resources. Many told me the hardest part was the sense of not being trusted after they'd done everything they could to survive. I want to pause and say this plainly. Survivors are not defined by what happened to them. They are not their trauma. They are complex people who live with the consequences and who often demonstrate extraordinary resilience. If you were affected by anything you heard today, please consider talking to someone you trust, a counselor, or a local support line. If you're not sure where to start, search for domestic violence or sexual assault hotlines in your country. Many organizations can help you find local services.
We began with a beach in Sweden and a shovel at night, and we moved through parked cars, hidden basements, attics that remembered children, the accidental death that reshaped a life, the slow vanishing of the mind, and the eyes in the cemetery that turned a dare into a story that follows people for years. We are left with the truth that these things happen not as spectacles, but as accumulations, a sound that goes unchallenged, a knock that is answered, a road skidded on, a mind that stops being listened to. I promised you earlier that I'd be true to the title. The title is meant to jar you. What these missing hikers went through will make you feel ill. Some of the people I spoke with were hikers, many were not. But what binds them, and what hikers should take to heart, is this. Vulnerability follows certain rules: isolation, small decisions, and the assumption that the ordinary will carry you through are the common threats. A missing hiker is often missing because something small went wrong at the wrong time. That is what makes these stories sickening: the proximity of normalcy to disaster. The dune, the shovel, the grin in the doorway. These are the pivot points. If you're here because you want to prepare rather than panic, hold those images as practice. Rehearse your exit routes. Keep your friends informed. Stay in contact. If you're someone who has been touched by these events, if you're a survivor, know that the world does not have to be the same as it was after what happened. People rebuild. They find ways to carry the memory and also to live with it. The guard who opened the basement door keeps patrolling because he believes living in awareness is a way to honor the people who couldn't leave on their own. The driver who caused Brent's death volunteered and spoke about slowing down. He tried to convert his guilt into action that might prevent another accident. These are imperfect human responses, but they are also important. Before we close, one final brief content note. The stories you heard include references to kidnapping, attempted abduction, accidental death, and severe psychological distress. If anything read here brings up immediate feelings of danger for you, call your local emergency services. If you need emotional support, contact a trusted friend, a counselor, or a crisis line in your area. Thank you for listening to these voices. I read them not to scare you, but to arm you, to remind you that ordinary choices have weight, and that attending to small signs can change outcomes. If you have an experience you want to share, something you saw on a trail, a near miss, or a way you've learned to stay safer, leave it in the comments below. Sharing helps people learn, and sometimes gives a survivor a small measure of being heard. If you want to keep hearing these kinds of survivor-centered stories, consider subscribing and watching the next video where I take one of these accounts, someone who actually went missing in a remote stretch, and dive deeper into the police reports, the timelines, and the search efforts. Whatever you do, go carefully into the places you love. Trails and beaches and old towns are precious, but they ask for our attention. When we give it, we keep each other alive. Remember the shovel on the beach, the grin in the doorway, the scream under the mansion, the light in the attic, the skid of a car on gravel. Let those images be warnings instead of curses. Stay with people you trust, carry a plan, and if you hear something that doesn't belong, step toward it or call someone who can. It may be the choice that saves a life. This is for the missing, the returned, and the ones still looking. Thank you for being here. If this episode mattered to you, tell someone you care about. Share the video. And if you have your own story, write it below. We'll respect your privacy, we'll honor what you share, and we'll try to keep telling these voices with the care they deserve.